If someone had followed me that night, an entire community would have been wiped out. It feels strange to say that out loud, even now, because for a long time I tried to pretend that weight wasn't real, that it wasn't my responsibility. But the truth is, the moment I crossed that invisible line in the woods, everything I thought I knew about isolation, silence, and being alone stopped being true. I wasn't lost. I was stepping into a place that was never meant to be found. That night, I wasn't looking for anything big. There was no scientific curiosity, no hunger for fame, no intention of proving anything to the world. I just needed to disappear for a few hours, to breathe far away from people, far from voices, far from the decisions that had been piling up in my life like a weight I couldn't carry anymore. The woods had always been that refuge, that place where human noise loses its grip, and even if only for a moment, you can believe something untouched still exists. What I didn't understand was that untouched didn't mean empty. It meant protected. As I kept moving forward, the feeling started to shift in a way that's hard to explain. It wasn't instant fear. It was a slow realization, almost too subtle to put into words. The air felt heavier, not from humidity, but from a kind of silent presence. The kind of quiet that isn't natural, that doesn't come from the absence of life, but from something watching and choosing not to reveal itself. That was the moment I understood I wasn't alone, even though I couldn't see anything at all. I kept walking because humans have this flaw. When something doesn't fit what we already know, we push forward as if reality is supposed to bend to our logic. Every step I took felt like it had been allowed by something I didn't understand. There were no clear signs of danger, no warning sounds, no animals bolting in panic. If anything, it was the opposite. Everything was still, like the whole forest was holding its breath. It took me too long to accept what was happening, because admitting it meant accepting something even more unsettling. I hadn't stepped into wild country. I had stepped into organized territory. There were patterns and visible pathways, an order that didn't depend on signs, fences, or human warnings. And above all, there was a quiet intelligence deciding whether I deserved to keep going. What scares me most to this day isn't what I saw later, but what I felt before. That uncomfortable certainty that if I did even one thing wrong, there wouldn't be a second chance. Not because I would be attacked, but because I would have broken an agreement that was never spoken, but had always been there. The kind of agreement that separates the people who make it out from the people who never come back. For years, I kept this to myself because I knew exactly how the world would react. Not with care, not with respect, not with silence. It would react with drones, cameras, thrill seekers, hunters, researchers, people desperate to turn it into a spectacle, into proof, into content. And that's when I realized the biggest danger that night wasn't what was hidden in the forest. It was what I could unleash outside of it. Before I go any further, I need to ask you something simple but important. In the comments, tell me where you're watching from. City, state, country. It doesn't matter where you are, because this story doesn't belong to just one place. It crosses borders, crosses different forests, crosses people who've never met but feel the same thing when they get too far from human noise. This story connects a lot of people, even the ones who haven't realized it yet. What I'm about to tell you isn't comfortable. It's not an adventure. It's not a bravery story. It's not a discovery story in the pretty sense of the word. It's a testimony about limits. A line between what can be seen and what should stay hidden. And more than anything, a line that separates curiosity from responsibility. If you stay with me all the way through, you'll understand why some truths don't set you free. They only condemn the person who carries them. You'll understand why I could never walk through the woods the same way again. And you'll understand why, that night, instead of being afraid of what was hidden out there, I started being afraid of what we humans do when we think everything belongs to us. Because that was only the first time I realized I hadn't found something lost. I had found something that was hiding on purpose. And without even knowing it, I had just crossed the point of no return. After that night, when the idea of a point of no return started taking shape in my mind, I had to look back and understand how someone like me ended up there. I was never an adventurer. I was never a hunter. I never had some obsession with mysteries or legends. My life, up until then, was made of predictable schedules, repetitive work, and this constant feeling like I was living on autopilot. Wake up early, get through tasks, come home too tired to think about the next day. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing that explained what was coming. I worked too much, and the harder I tried to keep everything in order, the farther away I felt from myself. Conversations were shallow. Days went by too fast, and the loneliness didn't come from being around no one. It came from the lack of meaning. That's when the woods became a refuge, not as an adventure, but as silence. A place where I could walk without answering questions, without having to explain anything to anyone. At first, it was familiar trails, marked paths, areas where other people passed through too. I knew exactly where I was, how long I'd stay, how to get back. Over time, that started to feel like not enough. Not for adrenaline, but out of need. The more predictable the path, the less it calmed that restless feeling inside me. And that's when the mistake started forming, before it even happened. One day, I decided to take a shortcut that wasn't on the map. Nothing dramatic, nothing that looked dangerous. Just a less used split in the trail, a narrower path almost swallowed by time. I remember thinking that kind of choice was harmless, that going a little deeper wouldn't hurt anything. After all, how many times do we cross small lines thinking we're still in control? The farther I went, the fewer signs of people I saw. No fresh marks, no trash, no distant sounds of anyone. Just trees, exposed roots, and this growing sense of isolation. Strangely, it brought me relief. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. And that's what made it even more dangerous. The mistake didn't come from fear, it came from comfort. I didn't notice the exact moment I stopped being in a normal place. There was no sign, no fence, no warning. Just a point where the environment shifted almost imperceptibly. The trail disappeared completely, the ground got rougher, and time started to feel strange, like I'd been walking for hours when, in reality, much less had passed. Still, I kept going, convinced I could turn back whenever I wanted. Looking back now, it's clear that was the decisive moment. Not the encounter, not the discovery, but the simple choice to keep going when everything was telling me to stop. If you've ever done something like that, type the word limit in the comments. Sometimes admitting that quietly says more about who we are than anything else. Loneliness I'd felt before didn't compare to this new feeling, deeper, almost physical. It wasn't being alone. It was being cut off from the human world. And still, I didn't feel threatened. That's hard to explain, but it's important to understand. Danger didn't show up as instant fear. It showed up as permission. Like I was being watched, and for reasons I still didn't understand, being tolerated. I started noticing small details that didn't make sense. Places where the vegetation looked too arranged to be random. Open spaces inside thick brush, as if someone had planned that layout. Nothing obvious, nothing I could point to and say, there it is. It was more like a pile of impressions your brain tries to ignore just to keep the feeling of normal. That's where I should have turned back. Any sensible person would have. But when you spend too long trying to escape your own life, the line between caution and stubbornness, it's blurry. I convinced myself it was all fatigue, imagination, too much time alone. The most comfortable explanation always wins over the most unsettling one. If you've ever ignored a clear sign, just so you wouldn't have to face the truth, comment, I felt that. This isn't about agreeing with me. It's about recognizing how these quiet choices shape everything that comes after. I didn't know then that the shortcut that seemed so harmless had taken me beyond a different physical space. It had taken me into a place where human rules didn't apply anymore, where silence wasn't absence, it was language, where solitude didn't mean abandonment, it meant surveillance. And while I kept going, convinced I still had control, something had already been decided without me knowing. Because the biggest mistake in that story wasn't going in. It was thinking I was just passing through. And that detail, small as it seems now, is what made it impossible to just turn around and pretend nothing had happened. The moment I realized I couldn't simply turn back and retrace my steps, I started noticing things my mind had chosen to ignore before. It wasn't an instant shock or a sudden revelation. It was a slow buildup of details that were too small to be scary on their own, but too strange to be coincidence. The forest was still there, dense, alive, but something in it felt restrained, like every sound was being measured. The first clear sign was the quiet. Not the normal quiet of empty trails or certain times of day, but a deep, uniform silence with no variation, no insects, no birds, none of that constant background noise you usually get in any natural place. It was like the forest had been paused. I walked for a few minutes trying to convince myself it was normal, that time of day or weather could explain it. But the farther I went, the heavier that silence became. Then came the marks. At first they were too subtle to stand out. Branches snapped at the same height, tree trunks with parallel scratches, like something large had passed through. Again and again. They didn't look like typical animal marks, but they weren't clearly man-made either. That ambiguity is what made me uneasy. Nothing screamed danger, but everything felt watched. If you've ever had that feeling of being somewhere that doesn't respond the way it should, comment the word watched. I kept walking, trying to hold on to logic. Telling myself the mind plays tricks when you've been alone too long, that exhaustion warps perception. Still, I began to notice things out of place. Stones stacked with almost careful intent. Pieces of wood lined up in spots where everything else looked wild and chaotic. It wasn't something you'd notice from far away, but when you passed close, it hit you with that strange feeling of hidden order. What was most disturbing wasn't seeing something out of place. It was realizing it was out of place for a reason. It didn't feel random or accidental. There was repetition. Discrete patterns, but consistent. The farther I walked, the more. Those patterns repeated, like someone had outlined specific areas, hidden corridors, where passage was allowed. And even without knowing how, I could feel it when I crossed those boundaries. That's when the sense of surveillance began. It wasn't fear of an attack, not panic. It was the uncomfortable certainty that I was being followed without being seen. No footsteps behind me. No obvious shadows moving. It was subtler, like when you walk into a room and the conversation stops, even though you never heard anyone talking. That perception of presence that doesn't depend on your eyes. More than once I stopped and stood completely still, trying to hear anything. What scared me wasn't the lack of sound. It was the feeling that any noise I made was suddenly too loud in that environment. Every step, every breath, every movement felt wrong in a space that operated by different rules, like I was the only thing that didn't belong. I tried to rationalize it every way I could. Protected land, natural phenomena, patterns I just didn't understand. The human mind always reaches for comfortable explanations before it accepts something that threatens its view of reality. And for a few minutes, it worked until I realized those marks weren't only on the ground or the trees. They were in the path itself. They guided, they divided. If at any point in your life you've ignored obvious signs just so you wouldn't have to admit you were wrong, type, I ignored it. This isn't about judgment. It's about recognition, because that's exactly what I did. I ignored the growing sense that this space wasn't neutral. It wasn't abandoned. It was occupied. Time started behaving strangely. I felt like I'd been walking a long time, but the light wasn't shifting the way it should. My body was tired, but my sense of hours felt scrambled. There were no natural clearings, no obvious escape trails. Everything seemed built for someone who knew it, not for someone invading it. And that word started pounding in my head. Trespassing. That's when it finally clicked. I wasn't dealing with wilderness in the usual sense. It wasn't just untouched nature. It was territory with its own rules, with silent organization, with a logic that didn't need to explain itself. And the most unsettling part was realizing I hadn't been stopped from entering. I had been allowed. That changes everything. Because when you understand you weren't blocked, but tolerated, fear takes a different shape. It's not fear of being attacked. It's fear of making a mistake, of crossing one more invisible line and losing that strange kind of permission. Every next step became calculated, even though I didn't fully know what I was calculating. The discomfort grew with every new detail I noticed. Nothing was obvious enough to be proof. Nothing was explicit. But everything, absolutely everything, pointed in the same direction. This wasn't a place the human world had forgotten. It was a place protected from it. And there, standing in the middle of that organized silence, surrounded by signs I could no longer ignore, I finally accepted something that changed the way I saw that forest forever. This wasn't wild territory. It was occupied territory. The moment I accepted it was occupied, my body reacted before my mind did. My skin felt sensitive, like the air had changed density, and every step demanded a kind of attention I'd never needed before. It wasn't fear of being attacked. It was something more primal, harder to explain. The clear feeling of being watched by something that didn't need to hide. It simply chose not to show itself. I walked a few more yards and stopped. Not because I heard anything, but because I felt that moving forward without awareness could be a final mistake. That's when I saw the first movement. It wasn't a full appearance, not a clear scene the way people like to imagine. It was a subtle shift between trees, a shadow that didn't match the wind, a shape too large to be mistaken for any normal animal. My heart sped up, but strangely my body didn't panic. There was no immediate urge to run. It was like something in me already knew running would be the worst possible choice. I stood there, trying to decide if it was real or just another trick of an exhausted mind. But the sense of presence intensified, making it clear I wasn't imagining it. What marked me most in that first contact was the posture. There was no aggression, no obvious threat. The figure partially visible stayed still, like it was assessing me. It wasn't animal curiosity. It was analysis. A calculated, cold observation, almost clinical. It didn't see me as prey. It saw me as a variable. I realized, with growing discomfort, that I wasn't being surrounded. There was no movement closing in, no attempt to block me, no show of force. It was as if that presence was there only to confirm something: my height, my behavior, my reaction. Every detail seemed to matter more than I wanted to admit. If you've ever felt that strange chill of realizing someone knows more about you than you know about them, type chills in the comments, because that's exactly what I felt. A silent vulnerability that's hard to accept. That brief eye contact was enough to shatter any remaining attempt to rationalize. It didn't react like a wild animal. It didn't spook. It didn't advance. It didn't retreat. It simply watched. And in that quick look, I knew I wasn't facing something impulsive. There was awareness. There was intention. I took a slow breath, trying to keep control, and stepped back carefully. No reaction. Another step. Still nothing. The figure stayed there, present, without any urgency. That was, maybe, the most disturbing part of all. If it wanted to stop me from leaving, it could have. If it wanted to attack, it could have. But it didn't. Little by little, I understood that situation had never been under my control. I wasn't deciding to leave. I was being allowed to leave. That realization completely rewired the logic of fear. Because when you realize you're not escaping, but being released, the question that changes everything rises up in your mind. Why were they letting me go? That question didn't come as curiosity. It came as weight. Because if there was permission, there were standards. And if there were standards, there were rules I still didn't understand. That presence wasn't there by accident. It was there to make sure something was respected. And somehow, up to that moment, I still hadn't broken that invisible code. I kept backing away slowly, without turning my back, without sudden movements. The silence held. No sound of pursuit, no sign of hostility. Only the constant feeling of unblinking eyes tracking every move. When I finally felt the distance was safe, the presence began to melt back into the landscape, as if it had never been there in any solid way. The strangest part was realizing that when it vanished from my sight, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it spread. Like that first contact hadn't been the only lookout point, but a confirmation. There was no way to know how many more might be there unseen, silent, attentive. If you've ever had the feeling something was studying you without showing emotion, comment observation. It helps you understand that this kind of experience isn't as isolated as it seems. I kept moving back with careful steps, trying not to repeat any motion that could be read as a threat. Every yard felt validated by that continuous silence. There was no immediate relief, no sense of victory, only the growing understanding that that first contact hadn't been a random encounter. It had been a warning that I had been seen, that I had been assessed, and that from that moment on, nothing I did inside that territory would be meaningless. Because if something was watching, there was memory. And if there was memory, that story was far from over. From the moment I began to move away from that first point of observation, something inside me had already shifted. It wasn't just the feeling of being seen anymore. It was the unsettling sense that the contact hadn't been isolated. The farther I walked, the more it felt like the space around me behaved like one living organism, not a random collection of trees and shadows. Like every part of the forest had a specific function, a silent purpose I was only starting to understand. In certain places, the ground looked deliberately cleared, no fallen branches, no natural obstacles. In others, the brush closed in strategically, as if guiding movement toward specific areas. I began to realize I wasn't just walking through tolerated space. I was crossing sectors of something much larger. This wasn't a shared territory by accident. It was divided. It was when I noticed simultaneous movement that the understanding finally took shape. A shift far to the left, another closer to the right, always outside my direct line of sight. There was no rush, no attempt to intimidate. It was coordination, something impossible to attribute to a single being acting on instinct. Each movement seemed to answer another, like parts of a system operating in absolute silence. My body reacted with a strange cold drop in my stomach. It wasn't panic, it was clarity. The clarity that I wasn't dealing with a lone creature, lost or wandering. I was in the middle of a collective presence, an entire community operating beyond human reach, not out of weakness, but by choice. If that resonates with you in any way, type community in the comments. That word changes everything once you understand the weight it carries here. I started noticing signs that had seemed merely curious before. Old marks mixed with fresh ones, pointing to permanence. Areas clearly not used for passing through, but for staying. Places sheltered from wind, rain, cold. And then came the detail that disarmed me emotionally the most. Smaller, more protected spaces, where the vegetation looked like it had been arranged to shield something fragile. There, without seeing anything directly, I understood they were young. I didn't need visual confirmation. The logic of that system gave it away. You don't build territory that divided, that quietly efficient, without needing to protect the most vulnerable. This wasn't just survival. It was care. And that realization weighs more than any fear ever could. If you've ever thought the instinct to protect isn't exclusive to humans, comment protection. In that moment, that word made more sense to me than anything else. The more that idea settled, the clearer it became that I was the foreign element there. Everything worked without me. Everything had been balanced before I arrived. I hadn't discovered something hidden because humans weren't paying attention. I had crossed a boundary that existed specifically to keep that balance intact. And that explained so much: the silence, the observation, the calculated permission. There were no signs of improvisation. Nothing looked rushed. It was a system that had been running for a long time. A system that learned, adapted, and above all avoided contact. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. They knew exactly what happens when humans feel entitled to something they don't understand. That silent awareness was, maybe, the most disturbing part of all. As I moved forward with extreme care, I started to feel a different kind of weight, separate from the first fear. Responsibility. Knowing that structure existed meant carrying knowledge that shouldn't be spread without consequences. I wasn't just an accidental observer anymore. I had become a variable inside that system. And variables are always handled with caution. At times, I had the impression that certain movements around me had a clear function, guiding me, not pushing, not scaring, just steering. Like there was an unspoken agreement about what to do with me. It's hard to accept, But when you realize it wasn't an individual reacting, but an entire group operating under shared rules, everything fits in an unsettlingly logical way. If at any point in your life you've realized you stepped into something far bigger than you expected, type bigger than me, because that's exactly how I felt there, small, watched, and at the same time reserved for reasons I still didn't fully understand. The idea of chance disappeared completely. This wasn't an unlikely encounter. It was proof that that system existed and had been functioning far from human eyes for a long time. There was no improvisation, no chaos. There was organization, memory, and a clear intention to remain unseen. And the more I understood that, the more a quiet question began to form, not as curiosity, but as warning. If there were many of them, if there was divided space, protected young, coordinated movement, then that territory wasn't just a refuge. It was a home protected with more discipline than any human place I'd ever known. And without realizing it, I was beginning to understand that the real danger wasn't that the community existed. The real danger was what would happen if someone decided to prove it existed. The more I moved with that awareness, the clearer it became that the place ran on strict rules. Even though no one had ever explained a single one to me, there were no signs, no warnings, nothing obvious saying don't, and still I could feel when I was where I didn't belong. It was almost physical sudden discomfort, pressure in my chest, a shift in the air that made me stop before I even understood why. In some stretches, my steps felt accepted. The ground stayed quiet. The movements around me remained distant, like my presence was being monitored and nothing more. In others, it only took a few yards for everything to change. Branches snapped too high up to be coincidence. Shadows repositioned outside my direct view. And that feeling of permission disappeared, like the environment itself was telling me I'd gone too far. The first time I ignored that warning almost cost me. I headed toward an area that looked more open, thinking it would make the way back easier. After just a few steps, the absolute silence was broken by a sharp, hard crack, not from the ground, but up in the trees. It wasn't an attack. It was a warning. Clear, calculated, and strong enough to freeze me where I stood. My body reacted instantly, before thought could catch up. I backed up. The moment I stepped back a few yards, everything settled again. No sound, no movement. That alone made it clear. Wasn't random. There were boundaries. And those boundaries were being watched in real time. If you've ever felt like you crossed an invisible line in life and had to pull back fast, comment invisible line, because that's exactly what it felt like. The certainty that one more step would be seen as trespassing, not ignorance. Over time, patterns emerged. There were areas clearly meant for passage, natural corridors, where movement seemed allowed. Others were zones of staying, protected almost absolutely. No explicit sign, just the constant sense that I wasn't welcome there. And what impressed me most was that these rules weren't enforced with instant violence. They were enforced with control. Even the timing started to make sense. At certain times of day, the place felt more active, even without clear sounds. At other times, everything became even, more contained, like the internal movement of that community was happening beyond my reach. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. And the more I respected those rhythms, the more tolerance seemed to hold. Every rule was learned the worst possible way, through mistakes. Never with a direct strike, but always with implied threat, a presence closer than before, a faster shift between trees, a sharper warning sound. It was forced learning with a razor-thin margin for error. They didn't teach. They tested. That made me understand something fundamental. That community didn't react like a cornered animal. It reacted like a social structure. There was surveillance, silent communication, and above all, memory. They remembered where I'd been, what I'd done, how far I'd gone. Every new attempt was measured against the last. If the idea of constant memory makes you uneasy, type "they remember," because understanding that changes everything about how you see that territory. At one point, I almost made the final mistake. I saw something in the distance, a different kind of movement, and curiosity rose up fast. I took a few steps toward it, ignoring every signal I'd learned to respect. The response was immediate. Not an attack, but an overwhelming presence, too close, too unseen. The air turned heavy, sound disappeared completely, and my body went into full alert. I stopped. I didn't move forward. I didn't run. I just stood there, still, knowing one wrong move could change everything. After a few seconds that felt endless, the pressure eased. The message had been delivered. That was the last warning. That's when I understood the most important rule of all. Tolerance isn't permanent permission. That community accepted my presence only as long as I showed absolute respect for the boundaries set in place. There was no room for persistence, no second chance for someone who kept pushing. That understanding brought a new kind of weight, because it meant that if I stayed too long, if I kept watching, recording, trying to understand more than I was allowed, the response wouldn't stay educational. It would become final, and that word echoed in my mind with terrifying clarity. If you feel like you've been in situations where insisting would have been irreversible, comment, I didn't push it. Sometimes survival is knowing when to stop. Every step after that was calculated around those invisible rules. I wasn't a lost hiker anymore. I was a trespasser being tolerated temporarily. And that changes everything. Because when you understand you're being watched by a system, not by one isolated being, every decision carries an unbearable weight. As I began planning my way out, one thing became clear. Those rules didn't exist to protect me. They existed to protect what was hidden there. And the fact that I was still alive, still walking, still breathing wasn't luck. It was proof that, up to that moment, I still hadn't made the unforgivable mistake. From the moment I left that territory, fully aware of the invisible rules, a different weight settled into me. It didn't come from the forest, or from the quiet surveillance I could still feel around me. It came from inside, because understanding what I'd found meant taking on a responsibility I never asked for. It wasn't just about surviving the experience anymore. It was about deciding what to do with it afterward. As I walked back, every detail I'd noticed rearranged itself in my mind. The organized space, the clear protection of the vulnerable, the collective intelligence, the calculated tolerance. It formed a picture that anyone would want to expose if they had proof. And that's exactly where the dilemma began, quiet, persistent. I knew I had enough to raise suspicion. Marks, patterns, fresh memories. A root burned into my head. It wouldn't take much to turn that into something showable. A camera, a planned return, maybe someone else with me. The thought came like a rational temptation. Prove it existed. Prove I wasn't losing my mind. Show the world I wasn't imagining it. But with that thought came another, heavier, darker. I know humans. I know curiosity that doesn't respect boundaries. The need to claim. The impulse to turn everything into content, into competition, into a trophy. It wouldn't take long for it to stop being a discovery and become an invasion. Where proof goes, hunters follow. Where stories go, explorers show up. Where attention goes, destruction arrives. If you've ever felt like revealing a truth could destroy something that should be protected, type heavy secret in the comments. Because that's exactly what started consuming me. With every step, the conflict inside me grew sharper. On one side, the idea that keeping it hidden was selfish. On the other, the certainty that exposing it would be a death sentence not for me, but for them. An entire community that had organized, hidden, and survived precisely because it understood the danger we are when we believe. Everything needs to be explained, cataloged, and controlled. I pictured it clearly. People going in without permission, ignoring the invisible rules I'd learned the hard way. Drones overhead, guns brought just in case. Researchers calling it scientific progress. All of it trampling the simplest truth, that territory already had guardians. Not owners in the human sense, but protectors, residents, families. The urge to record came back hard at one point. I saw a detail too clear something. That, if filmed, would erase doubt. My hand even moved on instinct, a small, automatic motion. And immediately, I felt the shift around me. Surveillance tightened, not as a direct threat, but as a reminder. A silent warning that the choice I was about to make would carry irreversible consequences. I stopped. Backing off wasn't a rational decision in that moment. It was instinct. An instinct that told me crossing that line wouldn't just break a rule. It would betray a trust that had never been spoken, but had clearly been built, because I had been watched, tested, and up to that point tolerated. And that wasn't something that would repeat if I returned with different intentions. If you believe not every truth needs to be exposed, comment, some things stay hidden. That sentence holds most of what I felt out there. From that moment on, it was clear that any attempt to report, it wouldn't be neutral. It wouldn't be justice or clarity. It would be indirect violence. I would be pointing at a target that couldn't defend itself against the kind of attention humans bring. And that awareness started demanding a psychological price. In the days that followed, far from the woods, the conflict didn't let me go. I replayed every detail, every movement, every sign. Part of me wanted to forget, to pretend it never happened. Another part of me knew forgetting would be its own kind of cowardice, because remembering meant carrying, and carrying meant accepting the weight of that choice. Forever, I pulled away from shallow conversations, from casual curiosity about mysteries, from anything that might push me to say more than I should. The fear wasn't being dismissed. It was being believed, because if someone believed me, the next step would be wanting to go there, and that thought was unbearable. If you've ever felt isolated because you were holding something you couldn't share, type, I carry this. Sometimes silence creates a loneliness that's nothing like being alone. Little by little, I realized there was no comfortable way out. Protecting meant lying by omission. Exposing meant destroying. There was no middle ground, no way to tell it carefully, because the mere existence of human attention would already be too much. That community didn't need saving. It needed invisibility. That dilemma started affecting my sleep, my focus, the way I looked at the world. Everything felt more fragile afterward, like I'd seen something that revealed just how dangerous we can be when we think we're doing the right thing. Human morality out there wasn't a guide, it was a risk. And even now, as I put these memories in order, that choice still echoes. Not as something resolved, but like an open wound that never fully closes. Because protecting something the whole world would destroy, if it knew, requires a kind of silence that costs. I had no idea how expensive that silence would become. Because the decision I made didn't stay inside my mind. It started shaping my life in ways I never expected. And without realizing it, the price of that choice was only just beginning to show itself. After the decision was made, silence stopped being a choice and became a daily burden. There was no relief, no sense of duty completed, only the certainty that something inside me had been shifted permanently. On the outside, I kept living the same routine. On the inside, I was on constant alert, like that forest had stretched itself into my mind. At first, I thought it was just emotional exhaustion. Then the signs got clearer. I avoided saying anything related to forests, isolation, mysteries, or disappearances. Ordinary conversations started to bother me. Simple questions sounded like disguised threats. Every news story about exploration, reckless tourism, or scientific curiosity stirred a physical discomfort I couldn't control. The fear wasn't that someone would discover what I knew by accident. The fear was that I would slip, that I'd say too much in a distracted moment, that I'd let a detail fall, that someone with too much curiosity could connect to another. I started measuring every word all the time. That kind of internal surveillance wears you down. You never truly relax. Slowly, I pulled away from people, not because I distrusted them, but because I didn't trust myself. I was afraid of making a mistake, afraid of giving in to the human need to share something no one else would understand. Relationships cooled without a clear explanation. Invitations declined, conversations avoided, messages left unanswered. If you've ever drifted away from someone and couldn't explain why, type, I pulled away. Sometimes isolation isn't a choice, it's a consequence. Sleep changed too. I slept little and woke often. Any noise outside the usual pattern snapped me into full alert. Footsteps on the street, cars slowing down, Sounds I would have ignored before suddenly carried too much meaning. The feeling of being followed wasn't constant, but it hit at the worst times, a sudden chill, the certainty someone was too close, even when no one was there. I even changed simple habits, different routes, different hours, less predictable places. All of it without ever saying why to anyone. From the outside, it probably looked like I'd just become more private. On the inside, it was someone trying to reduce every possible chance of being tracked, even without knowing by whom or for what reason. Knowledge creates that kind of quiet paranoia. At one point, I seriously considered moving away, not because I feared human pursuit, but because of a strange feeling of closeness, like that territory somehow knew I was still carrying it. It sounds extreme, but when you live something that shatters your sense of reality, the whole world changes texture. Nothing feels completely safe or neutral. There was one night that never left my memory. I was standing near a more isolated area, trying to sort through my thoughts, when I felt that same shift in the air. Again, the different kind of quiet, the subtle pressure. I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything, but I knew. I knew it hadn't stayed entirely behind me. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. There was no direct contact, no clear movement. Only the certainty that choosing silence didn't mean being forgotten. It meant ongoing surveillance. Like the simple fact that I existed with that knowledge was still something to be monitored. That realization weighs more than any physical fear, because there's nowhere to run from it. If you've ever felt like knowing too much changes the way you move through the world, comment never the same. That sentence says exactly what happened to me after. Over time, I started noticing how much that experience stole from me. Small things, but essential ones. The lightness of walking without overthinking, innocent curiosity, the urge to explore without calculating consequences. All of it got replaced by a constant sense of boundary, like I'd learned too early that not everything is meant to be crossed. The losses weren't only emotional. Some relationships never recovered. Some opportunities stopped making sense. I became more closed off, more watchful, less willing to share. And the most ironic part is that no one around me could understand the real reason. To them, I just changed. To me, I survived something that couldn't be explained. That's the real cost of silence. It isn't heroism. It isn't nobility. It's wear and tear. It's carrying something alone while the world keeps moving like nothing is out of place. It's knowing a fragile balance is being kept at the expense of your peace. And still, despite all of it, I never truly considered going back on it. I never seriously thought about exposing it, filming it, putting it out there. Because every time that idea surfaced, it came with that same old pressure in the air, as if the answer had been clear from the start. Some choices, once made, don't offer a way back. Thought the price had already been paid. Got the isolation, the constant fear, the quiet losses were the end of the bill. But I was wrong. Because the cost of knowing too much doesn't show itself all at once. It reveals itself slowly, in layers. And the heaviest part of this story was still ahead, hidden in something it took me a long time to understand. After everything I lived through, after everything I had to carry in silence, one thing became clear to me. Some truths don't come to set you free. They come to rearrange who you are in the world. None of it gave me peace. It gave me awareness. And awareness, sometimes, is the hardest weight to hold. That community is still out there, not because no one ever came close, but because it understood something we took too long to learn. Invisibility isn't weakness. It's strategy. It's survival. They don't hide out of fear of the woods, the weather, or isolation. They hide because they know our species better than we know ourselves. For a long time, I thought the biggest shock was realizing they existed. Today, I know that was only the surface. The real impact came when I understood their existence is only possible as long as we don't become too aware of it. The danger was never what was in the woods. The danger has always been what happens when humans believe we have the right to enter, record, name, and control whatever we find. That understanding changes how you see the world. Forests stop being just scenery. Silence stops being empty. And the idea of discovery starts carrying a shadow you can't ignore. Not everything that exists needs to be revealed. Not everything that's real needs to be exposed to have value. What I lived through didn't make me a better person. It made me more aware, more cautious, less willing to confuse curiosity with entitlement. Because once you understand what's at stake, you can't pretend you don't know. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable part of all, knowing there are old, organized, conscious secrets living at the edge of our sight. Not by accident, but by choice. A choice made to survive us. They weren't hiding from the forest. They were hiding from us. If this kind of truth hits you, if that silence unsettles you in a way you can't quite explain, the next video showing on your screen right now goes deeper into another side of that same world. It's not the same story, it's not the same event, but it touches the same raw nerve, something that's been out there, long time, watching in silence, holding secrets most people are never meant to hear.